Hey everybody, this is Dr. Jimmy Brown. I hope you're all doing great today. Want to make a quick little video to tell you a little bit about some different kinds of qualitative research designs and frame it a little bit because I know that can be kind of it's tricky for some folks to get when they're not experienced with it. So I know everybody likes those fancy hand drawing type of things, but we're going to go old school here and just run with the PowerPoints. So before we get into qualitative research designs, we have to first think of real quick about difference between qualitative versus quantitative. And basically, and I'll make another video later, get more depth on this, but to frame the difference between the two, in qualitative research, we're talking about how, what, or why. We're not worried about testable hypotheses. We are not trying to see if something's happening more than by chance alone. We're just looking at understanding the unique phenomena, looking for patterns and themes in the data, and we're not worried about generalization. This is, of course, compared to quantitative research, where we are looking about if and to what extent something's going on. We have testable hypotheses, we're looking for relationships, and we also are using statistics to figure out if what we're seeing is significant or not. And again, generalizability is our primary concern. So when we think about qualitative versus quantitative, that's an important thing to remember is we're looking at how and why. We're not as concerned about if and to what extent. We never have hypotheses, and we may have some numerical data, we may have some descriptive statistics, but we're not testing the significance of those findings. So when we think about qualitative research, there's a number of different designs, or some folks call them traditions. If you look at the older literature on qualitative research, they often call it traditions. In the newer research, they typically call it designs. I'm going to typically use the word design, this is what I'm most used to, with the most common things. And as far as today, what we're going to talk about are a few things. First is narrative research, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, and case study. Now, you may say, why did I pick those five? Well, basically, because if we go to Creswell's book that he did with Poth, those are the five that he focuses on. And a lot of folks default to Creswell. So I'm going to kind of start off with that. But I'm also going to throw in another one here, which is, bounce in there, generic qualitative or qualitative descriptive. And I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably, although when we get into it, I'll explain some nuances between those two. Please bear in mind, though, that these are not the only ones. For example, if we go look at Patton's work, and I'm going to post in the description a link to these books, he talks about autoethnography, which again is a kind of ethnography where you as the researcher are also the subject. He talks about heuristic inquiry. He also talks about hermeneutics, which are study of the written word, which we see a lot of that in, say, religious texts. Another one is systems theory, which they like those kinds of things. And there's also, even beyond what say Patton says, there's other things such as content analysis. And some folks actually put action research into a qualitative um, scenario, although there's some debate in the lit on that. So today, though, we're just going to cover these six on the left. We're not going to worry about the ones on the right. I may make a video at a later date that gets into more depth on those, but that's what we're focusing today. So let's start off with narrative. So narrative research is qualitative research that's focused on the stories of the participants. How do they tell the stories about what they have going on? Now, it really looks at the phenomena and the person's interpretation of that. So in-depth interviews are often used for that. I have a good friend of mine who did a narrative study for his dissertation, and he did it on his family, but he had to kind of get a weird thing for his debt collection where he didn't tell them that he was doing the interviews for it, because sometimes when you tell folks in the interview, it changes the story. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is there a picture of Bigfoot here? Well, because one of the examples I always use to think about narrative design is that we don't care if the story is true or not. We only care about the subject's interpretation of it. So I always use Bigfoot as the example because, if you go to a primatologist, they'll tell you, most of them anyway, will tell you there's no definitive proof that Bigfoot exists. However, from a narrative standpoint, we don't care if Bigfoot really exists. What we care about is that there are people who truly believe they've seen Bigfoot. There are people who truly believe they've found evidence of it. There's whole museums around it. So from a narrative standpoint, we don't care if they actually saw this thing or not, same thing like UFOs or whatever. What we care about is the person's story, about their experience and how they interpret it. So when we're thinking about narrative analysis, that is the key differentiator. Is it's the story, whether it's got any truth to it or not. It's that they believe it in their experience of it. If you ever watch Seinfeld, George Costanza, the character on there, has a saying where he says, "It's not a lie if you believe it." Narrative study, same kind of thing. So next thing we'll talk about is phenomenology. What is phenomenology? Phenomenology is looking at the lived experience of a participant from some particular event. It comes out of Herschler started it, and then Mustakas was the first one to really apply it to psychology, although Armand Georgi and then Roger Boumet are some of the main authors for it right now. But it's looking at that lived experience. And it can actually have a very small number of participants because you're looking at something that's unique that people have been through. Now, you may ask yourselves, well, what's these people staying online for? Well, that's because the example I always use for phenomenology is that we couldn't really do a phenomenology about what it's like standing online at the bank. Although I know right now the way banking's changed, people don't do it as much. But most folks have stood online at the bank at some point. Now, you could not do a phenomenology of that because it's not unique. It doesn't really impact us too much. Rarely is it a really life impacting experience. We could, however, do a phenomenology on what is like these long term psychological impacts of having been in a bank during an armed robbery. Why? Because it's a unique experience. It has long term psychological impacts. It kind of changes the way we behave around in situations. So that could be a phenomenology. It's all about the depth. I always tell people when you're doing a phenomenological study, you're going to do some of those in depth interviews you have ever done. And you're going to kind of get really in depth on that. We can sometimes use essays and other reflective processes, but for the most part, it's all about those in depth interviews. So that's kind of where that comes to. And also, when you're doing your analysis, it's really interesting. If you go look at, say, Georgie's analysis, you're not necessarily looking for what's called meaning units, which are individual parts of the interview process that create meaning. So you're not as concerned with the number of subjects. And I've seen good quality phenomenologies with as few as 5 people with very in-depth interviews, but you are looking for that meaning. So the next one we'll talk about is grounded theory. Now, what is grounded theory? Grounded theory is a qualitative process where we're trying to create a new theory about some phenomena. Typically done with interviews. We can also use observations, some questionnaires, um, but we're looking to gather something to create a new theory about what is going on. Now, one of the defining characteristics of grounded theory, and Strauss and Corbin or Grayson or Strauss, depending on which version of the books you look at, because they've been doing this for about almost 30 plus 40 years now. Um, One of the defining characteristics is that you have to keep going till you get saturation. So you'll do, 5 or 6 interviews, do some analysis, another 5 or 6, do some analysis, and you keep going till you're seeing the same themes over and over and over again. Now, this is one reason why, if any of you have ever been to a live residency with me, we talk about grounded theory. I really don't recommend these if you're doing this for, say, a school project or a doctoral dissertation, because you don't know if you're done until you're done. I have heard of grounded theory studies that have hit saturation at 12 or 15 people, but that's because they've had a very tight, unique, narrow set of experiences, and so they hit saturation very quickly. Most of the time, though, you're not hitting until you hit about 35 or 40 interviews. Which once you get into, if when I do a video on the interview process, I'll explain to you why 30 to 40 interviews is really, really difficult. I know of one guy who did a ground theory approach for his dissertation, was in the 65-ish range. And the reason why was he had a fairly broad sample of leaders, and was actually, when he did them, he's actually flying around and filming them. But, and they got very expensive, went very long. So I don't really recommend these too much for dissertation studies unless you have a very tight, unique sample, or it really is the only way to do it, because it's going to take you a while, and because you never know what you're getting yourself into. So we're looking now to ethnography. Well, what is ethnography? Ethnography is looking at the complexities of a group. It is looking at a particular cultural aspects. So, for example, the picture here is a guy because ethnography has grown out of the anthropological world. You're becoming very immersed in the culture you're studying. You're there for a long time. I have a good friend of mine. She did her actual doctorate in in anthropology and spent 2 years living with coal miners in West Virginia in a very rural town that was all but cut off from even there in Virginia. It was very cut off, very remote. Some of the folks there, as I understand, didn't have utilities. Very immersed in that culture. And you'll do some interviews, but you'll also do observations. And interesting thing about this is number one, you do want to start off with a theoretical model to frame what kind of interviews you're going to do, what your observation protocols will be. And so, one of the risks of ethnography is a lot of times people will lose their objectivity because they get so immersed in the culture, so focused that they lose their objectivity and they start identifying too much with the subject they're studying. So that's one of the risks there. So we'll go next to case study. And the picture here is Robert Yen's book. Um, Robert K. Yen is probably the go-to on case study. I've seen very few get questioned if they use that as their source for how they're going to approach it. But a case study, you see a lot of these in business. Harvard Business Review publishes case studies all the time. It's an in-depth study of one or more cases of a particular process or activity. When we think about a case study, it's defined by a couple of things. One is a bound unit of analysis. One company, one organization, one industry. It also has multiple sources of evidence, not just data, but evidence. And these are sources of data that inform the particular phenomena we are studying. And we also triangulate amongst those. What does triangulation mean? Triangulation means that we're going to compare and contrast what those different sources of evidence say so that we can make sure that what we're seeing is really going on. We can use interviews, we can use focus groups, archival documentation. There are times we might use questionnaires. It can use both qualitative and quantitative analysis in the sense that we might look at, say, if we're doing a company, we can look at their financial performance over time, but we're also going to focus on the interviews and the focus groups to understand what drove that performance outcome. So again, we're not just say testing a difference like we would in quantitative, but we are looking at the how and the why, but that quantitative data may help us inform what we're looking at. So the last one we'll talk about here is generic qualitative or qualitative descriptive. And I'm going to use these terms intermittently because you do see them used interchangeably in a lot of research, but they're a little bit different. So generic qualitative is typically used in psychology and business literature to apply to things that don't neatly fit into other areas. Qualitative descriptive is typically used more in nursing research and education research, where we're going to simply describe a phenomena that we don't know enough about to figure out what we need to do with yet. It's relatively simple, and we're just simply looking to describe. So our research questions will say things like, how do, say, nurses describe X, Y, or Z? How do educators describe their experience working with, special needs students in some particular scenario? Our primary source of data are usually things like interviews and focus groups, but we can have additional sources of data to look at things like our field notes or questionnaires or observations. If you're doing a qualitative descriptive or a generic qualitative as a university study, some schools require multiple sources of data, some don't. There's conflicting requirements in the lit of what what they should be, whether you need more than one source of data or not. Again, in research, you can kind of do whatever you want if you can find sources to cite it, and you'll find different sources for that. Some folks consider it the least rigorous of qualitative designs. I personally disagree with that because if you take a good qualitative descriptive and you go through a rigorous process to collect your data, you do reflexivity to check your biases, you go through a very clear qualitative analysis process, it's still pretty rigorous. but there are other folks who kind of feel differently. So our last page here, these are the three books that I mentioned. I'll actually put comments about, I'll put these in the description, and I'll also put links to these on Amazon, so you can find these if you want to, and hopefully found use for that. If you did, please be sure and like the video, share with others, and don't be shy about subscribing to the channel, because I'm going to try to do more videos in the future. So thanks a ton. Hope you guys have a great day. Talk to you soon.